Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. The behavior and activities exhibited by offenders that distinguish lust murderers from among other types of serial murders are presented through a multiple case studies analysis of the offenders' psychosocial histories and offense patterns. The lust murderers examined include Theodore Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and Dennis Rader, BTK. The study advocates that a primary function of the development of typologies is to provide aid and assistance in the investigation of violent crime, specifically violent, sexualized homicides. The book that we're featuring this evening is EROTOPHONOPHILIA-Investigating Lust Murder, with my special guest, author and Dr. Janet McClellan. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview, Dr. Janet McClellan.
It's my pleasure, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very, very interesting book and very, very fascinating subject, so equally fascinating interview, I anticipate. Now, give us a little bit of just your background. I alluded to it, and I even messed it up a little bit, but you're a professor and you have a PhD, and you're a doctor. Tell us a little bit about your background before we talk about this incredible study.
Certainly. I spent years as a law enforcement officer, investigator in specific. I was also the executive director of the maximum security facility for violent sex offenders in the state of Kansas. Like I said, I spent years in law enforcement as well, and of course, while I was working in both law enforcement and corrections, I was pursuing my various degrees, ending up with, of course, as you noted, the PhD in criminal justice, and I'm currently the chair for the master's program in criminal justice with Kaplan University.
Very, very impressive. Now, you say you started off in law enforcement. This is not typical in terms of where you started, your starting point and your end point. So was there a turning point at some point in your law enforcement career? How did you really go from the law enforcement all the way to where you are here, which is almost a completely different position, obviously?
It's very different. I began as a law enforcement officer in the city of Leavenworth, Kansas, when I was 19, and I was an undercover narcotics investigator for the city of Leavenworth. I'm sure that you're familiar with Leavenworth through its historical background as having a number of corrections facilities, prisons.
Certainly.
Yeah, particularly, the famous or infamous federal penitentiary of Leavenworth. My father was a deputy warden at Kansas State Penitentiary when it was Kansas State Penitentiary, and of course as it became the corrections facility. So I suppose I came by my my career, or both of these careers, in criminal justice rather naturally.
Yeah, very organically, yes.
Right. As a matter of fact, I have to tell you, it's been a long-standing joke, if you will, that my father and I had, that between us we had a small business, in regards to criminal justice, since he was a deputy warden and I was in law enforcement, that I would catch them and Dad would keep them.
Yeah, catch and no release. Yes. Catch and no
release. So anyway, so I began at that period of time, and quite frankly, the police chief with whom I worked in Leavenworth was very strong in his opinions about the necessity of education, particularly higher education for law enforcement officers. And as a result of that particular influence, and I had been pursuing a bit of college at that time anyway, really I have to credit him for that continuation of interest in higher education. And I suppose you might say that after the bachelor's and master's and a program in that, I just sort of, it seemed a natural trajectory.
Right.
From one thing to the other, if for no other reason than at each point of that academic advancement, the subject matter with that in which I was engaged was so fascinating, and it lent itself so well to not only the sort of organizational processes and environments in the various criminal justice agencies in which I was working, but because of the kind of coursework that I was doing in criminal investigation, and that lent itself handily to support really the investigations that I was doing in the field.
Right. Yeah, so you could really relate to the things that you were learning, the lessons that you were learning.
Absolutely. And I found my interest both in the criminal investigation aspects, but then also such things as investigative process management, good policies, those sorts of issues, and applied them. So
right.
Yes, each step seemed to work itself together with the last.
Now this book examines lust murder, but before you came to this, you obviously had done extensive research. Just prior to this, what were you, other than lust murder, but I mean, you obviously studied serial murder. What was your area of research, say, prior to this lust murder examination?
Well, that's a good question, because actually serial murder or violent sexualized homicide really became the focus of my interests, research, personal readings, as well as directing my course of studies. In the mid-1970s, early mid, I was a police officer in the state of Washington with the campus police at Ellensburg. I had been hired there, and when I arrived, a young woman who had been a student there by the name of Susan Rancourt had been abducted and slain by that time by an individual whom we did not really know, but ultimately turned out to be Ted Bundy.
Right.
So at that point, I had also I rather fit the physical description of the young women that he was killing. So between spending a wee bit of time as bait, and then I also have because of my arrival there, my interest and some of the early research that I had begun at that time just in homicide and investigations, I was able to become a member of one of the multi-agency task forces that were formed to investigate into those murders. And so I had a great opportunity to work with those folks, and and learn a great deal. The FBI came out and provided a significant amount of training to those of us that were in some of those multi-agency task forces. And so really my whole direction in terms of interest was formed quite early on because of those murders that were taking place. It really began with a question. Simply at that point in time was, why? Why is somebody doing this? What are they doing? Why are they doing it? Why are they doing it in this particular way? What are we seeing here? And what we're seeing, what do those things mean? So really, exactly. That was the start.
Well, they're by far the most dramatic of the killers is the lust murderers, and obviously they leave more questions than answers, especially years ago. And with the work that you've done, it's not that there is a comprehension, but there's more of a comprehension on the why and where that came from, and identifying those characteristics that are shared between these type of killers. What I wanted to ask you too is that tell us a little bit, for those that don't know, that where the conventional wisdom came, because what's interesting, I guess, in this context is that tomorrow evening I'm going to be interviewing Mark Olshaker, which is the half of the writing team of John Douglas, the famous criminal profiler. So tell us where the bulk of the material came, and then we can talk about the previous studies and then the studies that you took off from. Obviously, research it evolves, and so tell us where some of this first information came, and then tell us about the development of the understanding of lust murder, and then we can maybe introduce how you started and why this book that investigates lust murder, and we're talking about 2010, so the most current information.
Okay. What I've been doing, of course, for years is following the writings and the research of a wide variety of broad authorship of folks who were researching and writing about essentially lust murder or serial murder investigation. And some of the earliest writings, again, that would take you back into the mid to late 70s, when it was essentially in its infancy. At the beginning of, if you will, when the FBI had their what they called then their behavioral science unit. And of course, folks like Douglas and Munn created various tables and analyses, Keppel and others, Holmes and Holmes, in an attempt to try to look at the data, and it was small data at that point. I think the FBI did its behavioral analysis documentation on was on fewer than 30 persons who were identified as serial murder. Of course, there's been a long-standing discussion or argument, if you will, as to, in regards to serial murder, its full and complete definition. In part, is it serial if it's only 2? Do we wait for 4? And wait in terms of defining it or identifying it as such by the investigators, and there are various and sundry people that fall within those arguments for whatever reason. I rather advocate that 2's enough.
Sure.
To call it serial. The word serial is a more contemporary use of that word. If you think about serial as being simply serial murder or serial burglary, or serial armed robbery, or what we're talking about is a continuation, a successful continuation of a certain type of act. I say successful because the individual is still free to continue that activity over time and place. So in looking at that, and essentially over in that growing data and the various ways in which those persons, both academicians and criminologists and other types of investigators into the issues, examined the question of essentially the one that I had was, what are these people up to? What's going on? Are there means or ways of identifying? The whole purpose in law enforcement is an attempt to protect individuals. So if you can figure out how to more quickly identify an unknown suspect, or identify maybe what might be a cohort of types, therefore the idea of typology, so that you can narrow your investigation into something of a reasonable and practical best benefit side in terms of the identification and capture. Those are really the kind of key issues in regards to serial murder investigation. Having said that, lust murder does not necessarily mean that an individual has committed a series of those types of murders. That type of murder exists. Violent sexualized homicide, which is sort of the perspective that I take on it, can be just a one incident, but the best ways, perhaps, of conducting the investigations all go back to the identifying of the types of violence committed against the individual who is the ultimate victim, what was done, and things that occur at a crime scene that might give indication as to the type of individual that committed it, and therefore help you work on your investigation.
Now, for those that are listening to, what we should explain a little bit here too, and this is interesting to me and news to me as well, at least from what I've read, and again, it doesn't come anywhere near any kind of research like you describe and you undertake. But what I found interesting was that what you talk about in your book is that lust murder it involves sadism, and what people normally talk, what I would think too, and I had to wrap my head around this, was that you talk about redefining that as not only the violence that was perpetrated on this victim before they were murdered, or say, for example, a very simple example of torture before murder, and there's evidence of that, is that you indicate that, say, the displaying of the body, posing of the body, necrophilia, we'll say, for example, or mutilation, should be and are defined. This is what you say, and hopefully I'm not paraphrasing or getting this wrong, that this is part of the sadism that the offender was trying to inflict on his victim. And so that's
right. Or the individuals who come along and discover the offense, whether they're civilians or the law enforcement personnel themselves. In that regard, it's an attempt to inflict psychological harm, to shock, to appall.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
So it's
this would extend to all the behavior. We'll say, for example, Albert Fish writing a letter to the victim's family and saying how much he enjoyed killing and eating their child.
Yes, he would have enjoyed writing the letter. He would have enjoyed anticipating them reading the letter.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So I thought, and so that's a new. you have redefined this, or is it this has occurred in the development of the understanding of lust murder?
It's as a result of the research that I did. This is the way in which I have come to define that regarding what occurs in those purposeful displays or actions that I think that we can fairly easily define as that which focuses on that individual's desire, intent to inflict pain. Yeah, that's based on the research that's out there, and I just simply drew that conclusion based on what was being presented. Right.
So, for example, if you were to see a posed body or a displayed body, and you were to see some of this post-murder offense activity, you would then be able to classify that as information, or use that as information to gather more evidence to create this profile on this offender?
Well, yes, it's a piece of it. Think of a display. Just the idea that the body is displayed is a piece of information that essentially that what one is looking at is a piece of a constellation of artifacts that exist at a crime scene, and quite frankly, I have to advocate for what Keppel and Walter developed as the idea that the last crime scene in a murder situation, the last crime scene is the crime scene in which one finds, locates, and discovers the body. And when I say that's the last crime scene, Keppel and Walter advocated for and very, very clearly, wonderfully defined the great and very specific possibility that within any criminal event that, frankly, there's 5 crime scenes easily that can occur. And by that I mean that the place where the body exists is just the last scene. It's not the first scene. It is the one of which there is much focus necessarily and correctly, but it's only one scene that exists within a number of scenes of any violent crime. So let's say this is where, for example, if an individual is a victim is taken from let's say a bar downtown, and I'm thinking of a particular case that occurred in Kansas City, probably about a decade ago. The young woman was taken from near a bar in the downtown location, transported some 12, 15 miles outside of town into a rural area, killed, and her body set on fire. Okay, so where the body was found, discovered, quite frankly, as a result of neighbors seeing fire in the field, if you will, that was the last scene. The transportation itself from the point of the bar out to the field was itself a scene. Therefore, you have a vehicle, a car, a truck, something that transported her. That's a scene. And you have the place at which she was acquired, the in or around that bar, which is a scene in and of itself that needs to be examined and discussed as a part of the investigation.
Sure. Now, with your examination, what I didn't put in the introduction but is very evident in your book, in your explanation, is that you took the effectiveness and the efficiency of the typologies of lust murder as researched by, I'll just name the researchers, Goodwin in 2000, Holmes and Holmes in 2002, Keppel and Walter 1999, and Coxis, Cooksey, and Irwin in 2002. And now, and the book is focused, or you do examine the cases of Theodore Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and BTK Dennis Rader. Tell us what you. I mean, obviously there was a wealth of knowledge to be gained by examining the research that these dedicated researchers did. But what was the main issue that you felt was lacking, obviously, and one of the reasons why you undertook this examination yourself of lust murder? What was missing in your mind once you went through all the information and from all your own personal reading sources?
Right, that's a good question, because what those four theories or theorists, if you will, that have created those typologies of serial murderers.
Right.
Each one of them has, if you will, sort of a four-set typology, in which characteristics of particular offenders, you could say that one, for example, one is disorganized, one's organized, which is the simplest profile,
right.
and inaccurate, but each one of these very fine researchers and theorists have these typologies, and they're rather competing typologies, if you will. And it was that competition that was a part of my question was, is it true that any one of these could better identify, explain the psychosocial development, the psychological history, if you will, that we know of these three individuals that you just mentioned, Bundy and BTK and Jeffrey Dahmer? Could any one of them explain them, identify, could they fit better?
Right.
And so what I did was by doing these cases of these three individuals, essentially based on all the information that we have about them, looked at how well do they fit in any one of the types within the typology. Is one better than the other? And essentially, for me, the upshot was that after I went through those particular examinations, that it wasn't so much a matter that any one of those typology sets better did one over the other, but what they did do was provide if you want to put them together, you had a much more comprehensive analysis
right.
that one could use. So think of it as a net. Think of it as a net. You use one net and you're fishing. Some fish can get through the holes in the net. Add another net within that, the holes of the net become smaller. And again. And so that's essentially where I arrived at, if you will, at the end of the research, was that all four of these, rather than competing, are complementing each other.
Right. Yeah, so you want to put something comprehensive and dispel with some of the stuff that, as you put it, might be incongruent.
Yes, and one of the things that makes it just a wee bit difficult, or they can, is that each one of these typologies and the theorists devised names for the categories of those types that you don't do a one-to-one match. So you have to be able to identify if I'm calling somebody an asocial offender or disorganized, is that somebody else's sadistic murderer or psychological aberrant in whatever other category. So it's finding that how well each of those match within, so that you get a clearer definition of a more comprehensive profiling opportunity than you would using any one of them.
Okay, I think I understand. Excuse me. Now, other than the general infamy or fame of these three serial killers that you decided to study specifically, Bundy, Dahmer, and Dennis Rader. Why did you pick those three? We know you had not alluded to, but you spoke about your connection early on with Bundy, but tell us why you picked these three cases specifically.
The breadth and depth of the information available for each one of these individuals is significant. We have, when I say we, there is available. One can acquire through some research and some effort a great deal of information about their childhood, their early development, what people saw in them, thought about them when they didn't identify them as murderers.
Right.
What we know about their crime-specific behavior, how ultimately the victims were identified. Victim number one, number two. Just because you find the body, that this is the first body you find, does not mean that's the first victim that exists.
Sure.
For that individual. So a great breadth of information about that person, psychological profiles, IQ tests, high school grades, those kinds of things that are available. Okay.
Did you review personal interviews? Because I know all three of those characters did a fair amount of interviews as well.
Yes, I did an incredible amount of reading on all. I think it felt like it anyway on all three of those individuals, so that I could pull from the interviews that were conducted, whether they were conducted when they were arrested. At one point, for example, Dahmer spent time in jail. He was on probation, and so he had some comprehensive evals that had been done on him through the court system, much like the others. So, there was a great deal that one could delve into so you could find out. For example, if Douglas says that in his research ever says that a person who does this thing, this kind of murder, they have an IQ under, roughly, most often found to have an IQ under, let's say, 100. Okay?
Right.
That they do manual labor, this, that, and the other. Well, how well does that fit with what we know about, any one of these three individuals?
Right.
For example, I know that you know that they may always make much ado about the fact that they say, Jeffrey Dahmer was quite bright. He had an IQ of 115.
Right.
Which actually is not that much.
No.
The average IQ of the federal inmates serving time in the Bureau of Prisons is 115.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Oh, yeah. Right. The research regarding the average IQ of the successful bachelor's degree person, somebody who succeeds and get a bachelor's degree here 10 years ago was 120. So he may have, he was a little bit brighter than maybe the average if we wanted to play from 90 to 110 as average, but that's not superstar material.
No. Yeah, they're not evil geniuses.
No. And at the same time, you have Gary Ridgway, who underwent a number of IQ tests, and he has a IQ. His best IQ test showed him at 89.
Yeah.
And then he has, if you count the number of bodies in terms of serial offenses, he has an extraordinary record. So it's not about IQ.
No. Picton was like that, too. He's a half-wit as well. And he's got 49 or something, too. 33, 49. Enough to prove his prowess, I guess.
Well, whatever it was that he was, proving or doing? What was the last name again?
Picton, Robert Picton, Vancouver. All the women on. He was a pig farmer, and so. Yes,
I am familiar with that. Yeah. He figured out how to do it, and that really was the key. If we look at Jeffrey Dahmer, and you talk about serial murder and the way in which he committed the murders, in terms of analyzing it, and you saw it's almost the way he did it was almost boring. It was like going to work.
Sure.
Go out to the gay bar, offer somebody some money or beer on the way, to go home, give them some beer, have some drugs in the alcohol, take pictures, kill them. Dismember. Time and time and time and time and time again.
Yeah. Yeah, it was an interesting story too, because Ressler and Douglas are both from the early days of doing the profiles on the 30 serial killers or so, and but they really had a difference of opinion, to say the least, when Ressler was ready to testify, or did testify on Dahmer's behalf, to say that he was insane, and Douglas argued that he wasn't, and Ressler characterized they talked about organized and disorganized, and Dahmer went from, in his own testimony, organized, very organized and careful, to sort of erratic and disorganized, yet he was going to be evicted from his apartment. So when you read the interview, it's almost like he was stressed out because he had to move. But certainly...
Right. If you look at Dahmer's early history, his childhood and the family dynamics. First of all, just going to Dahmer himself, he was a full-blown, committed to alcohol, by the time he was 14. Now, to be a fully committed alcoholic, by the time you're 14, there's been other stuff going on. Something moves you along that particular path.
Certainly.
Now, Dahmer stated, and his father denied, that he had been sexually molested by a neighbor boy when he was 10. Also,
and that sounds reasonable, because Dahmer in the interviews was very forthcoming, and was not as much like a lot of these guys, wasn't blaming everyone in his family and everyone on Earth for his behavior. So there's some credence to him saying that.
Right. Well, also, when one looks at Dahmer's early history, he's alcoholic at 14. It's not so much as a masking of he'd been sexually molested, or states that he was sexually molested. That's going to traumatize a child. There were other things going on. There were physicalities, points of particular physical attributes that began to appear, characteristics in his very early, his preteens and his very early teens. The way in which he moved, his lack of coordination, a stiffness of frame, a flatness of affect, all these things, if anybody was looking or knew how to look, and that's always a problem, knew how to look and examine, could have given indications that you were looking at a early forming schizophrenic.
Okay.
And as a matter of fact, the medications that he was given while he was in prison before he was killed are those sorts of medications that are given to an individual who has schizophrenia. So by the time he gets interviewed, he's balanced.
But at the same time, the vast majority of schizophrenics don't commit murder, though.
No, they don't. But on top of on a number of these other complications, think of it as a constellation of things occurring. And so, with the early family dynamics, if you will, from what I've seen, it seems as though there may have. I'm not a physician. I'm not a psychiatrist, but there are benchmarks that indicate that the likelihood of schizophrenia
the alcoholism that continued throughout his life, of course, until he gets into prison, and that's really about the only time. The family dynamics were significant. He goes off and is trained by the military. At first, they put him in the MP division to be trained as an MP. He doesn't make the firearms qualifications, so then he's transferred over and becomes essentially whatever a medic is. So he learns some further interesting information about body dynamics. So it's this constellation of things culminating to a point where then you may have some actionable processes going on. So he committed his first murder during his, the summer after his high school graduation.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, tell us, because, your book explains the route or the progression from fantasy, violent sexual fantasies to this lust murder. When we're talking about Dahmer, let's stay there because there's been he was very candid, or tried to be anyway, or it seems so, that he wanted to be very forthright about what happened, and he went on to say, "Oh, if I knew," and this was a compulsion. In your study for this book, what was the fantasy that was first that first developed within Jeffrey Dahmer, and then what was that fantasy, and then how did that fantasy, in real terms, progress?
There isn't really a one. And I have to tell you that the research, and you probably haven't fallen across it in the book yet, in terms of in looking at the book. But when we talk about fantasies and violent sexualized fantasies,
right?
There's been actually a number of very good pieces of research that have asked about and fantasies and violent fantasies of non-incarcerated persons, including college students. And there's not much difference.
Right.
Which makes sense if you stop and think about the a large number of the videos that are in the video store.
Sure.
Many of them are violent, sexualized fantasies, whether it's war theme or the eyes, the hills have eyes, and the rest of that whole genre kind of thing. A lot of those are sadistic, violent, sexualized, homicidal, entertainment.
Never really thought about it that way. Maybe I should have. No, I see what
the same way again.
Well, I see what you're saying, but the phenomena is much more than that's just regular folk. With this Luca Magnotta from Montreal that killed the victim apparently online, and then did atrocities to the body, necrophilia online. Incredible amount of followers. I read all kinds of comments from people that were worshiping him, wanted to sleep with him, wanted to follow him, talking about his allegiance to Satan. It was incredible, the amount of followers, the amount of people that were commenting, the amount of people that were interested in this guy.
An awful lot of those movies get purchased or rented daily.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say is the phenomena is now is that there's actual gore sites that posted Luca Magnotta's video and other videos showing either cruelty or murder or beheadings or. So it's incredible, the phenomena. Like you said, college students is surprising, but regular people take that, walk that edge, I guess, psychologically, and find entertainment from the sadistic treatment of people. Sometimes fictional, it's confined to, but often non-fictional, like I said with the Luca Magnotta case.
Well, if we consider history, and the history of violence and torture in the world, in the United States in the late in the 1800s, 1700s, into the early 1900s, the executions were public displays.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bringing the whole family.
Exactly. Part of it was to purportedly because it was supposed to be a social lesson. At the same time, there were people there for entertainment. Yeah. It was that which was scheduled entertainment, and could have was perceived as such. Go a little further back in history, and yes, it was entertainment. The unspeakable acts by what we consider otherwise ordinary people is a common theme in the history of the world. Think of Abu Ghraib.
Yeah, sure, certainly.
Right.
Now, did the murders? Pardon me. When we talked when you talk about the murders of Ted Bundy, a lot of people that don't know the entire story, and certainly some people don't know about the necrophilia and visiting the bodies and some of the stuff that now is obviously is regarded as this. He's regarded as a lust murderer, but to the person that didn't know some of those facts and just saw a killer bludgeoning or beating with a pipe or a bat or whatever his victim, they wouldn't see what somebody might classify as this as a lust murder. Tell us what you found out about what you discovered about Ted Bundy and in regards as Ted Bundy as a case of lust murder.
Okay. Let me begin with stating that lust murder, the phrase, does not indicate that the individual was doing violent sex. Okay, it is sexualized violence, which means that the purpose of the acquisition of the victim, the violence against the victim, those things are all part and parcel of that which underpins the motivation. Those things that we attribute to lust or the sexualization of the actions are fairly secondary to the harm, the injury, the humiliation, the death of the individual. So it's as an old saying used to go, it says, using sex as a weapon. It's just yet one more weapon, as much as the ice pick, the knife, the gun, the barbed wire used to bind an individual's hands, the garroting of the person as with BTK. Death is the culmination. Sex is an aspect. So lust murder just doesn't mean that lust, sex, hasn't really that much to do with it. What you're looking at is that it's an artifact of the crime as a whole. And think about that lust, if you will. Well, let me back up. Human beings exist on a continuum of violence, right, in terms of who it is that we are. And when I say so it's not, these behaviors are not siloed. The Jeffrey Dahmers and the Ted Bundys of the world are not removed from the human environment, from the human continuum. They are on that continuum. What it is that they do, as violent and as abhorrent as it is to the vast majority of us, it is still all human behavior. And so think of it as a continuum, that on one side, if we can say so, that on one hand you have the Mother Teresas of the world, and that of that type of behavior and interaction with human beings. And on the other side, on the far end of the other side of the continuum, you have the Pol Pots and Hitlers and Stalins on that side. And then,
right.
Okay, and so then Dahmer and Dennis Rader and Harold Shipman of England exist on that continuum between those extreme poles.
Right.
Okay, and so do their behaviors towards their behaviors towards others. It's a part of that continuum. So, as you note in the book, I rather argue against the fact of thinking, particularly for the investigator, to not think about or attempt to categorize these individuals as monsters, because once we do that, we take them out of the human category and consider them the other. And then as such, we lose sight of some very basic issues that we need to be able to consider and be mindful of in an investigation. For example, Dennis Rader complained at one point that he wasn't able to acquire a victim that he wanted to because his son had a game that day.
Okay.
He had other life to attend to. So they go to the grocery store, they go to the laundromat, they go to school. Dennis Rader went to work every day. Ted Bundy went to school, took classes. There are these other life factors that play in. And one who's not aware of that on that continuum and with those individuals in an investigation, we lose points of process and investigation.
Well, that's interesting too, because the killers themselves retain their humanness. That was part of their ruse, in that they were very charismatic, at least enough to get many victims to comply. So obviously, if you want to,
right. Well, at the same time, that how many times have you heard from a person, somebody gets arrested for some type of violence, up to and including murder, and the people who live next door to them go, "Well, he seemed like such a nice guy."
Sure.
Right. I would offer that it's not so much that he seemed like a nice guy. They didn't know him. They weren't paying attention. Any more than perhaps we all pay attention, or lack thereof, of our neighbors. We're not focusing in that particular way, because we don't have to. We're all rather busy people, with our own lives, and so we're not assessing or analyzing people's interactions. And in most regards, most people are going to assume, unless given some sort of notice, that someone interacting with them does not necessarily mean them any harm.
Right.
And at the first sign or indication that it might be, then that if you feel that in a contact with an individual, that changes your demeanor towards them, does it not?
Oh, certainly.
Right. And so your radar goes up at that point. And if you don't have that indication, or maybe you don't have a good radar, then one can, find themselves, on the wrong end of a situation.
Right. Now, we're talking about serial murder. You had some interesting statistics in your book. You says that 6,000 or more homicides go unsolved in a 10-year period, is it, or a 1-year period? You say that represents 33% of annual murder rate. Okay, so it's per year.
Annual. Right.
Okay, 6,000. And And you agree, basically agree with the FBI's assertion that there be about 63 serial killers responsible for approximately 750 murders, almost a dozen each.
On an average, yeah.
So we're talking about lust murder being a small subcategory or a small segment of the total amount of murders. What kind of percentage of do you believe that are lust murderers, and what would that come in terms of actual numbers?
Well, as you know, the murder rate, homicide rate in the United States has been going down significantly since the mid-'80s.
Right.
So I think in the mid-'80s it was somewhere around 28,000 a year per year, and it's back to the level. I think if I remember right, it's about 16,000, which is kind of reflective of the approximately 16,000 a year, reflective of what the mid to late 1960s was. Having said that, in the mid 1960s, the solve rate, identify, bring to justice, arrest the individual who committed the murder, solve rate, was 95%. Pretty good.
Yeah, incredible.
Yeah, it was good. Now, however, the average in the U.S. Is, I believe, about 65%, 66%. Now, the types of, if you will, bells and whistles that we had available to us nationally in the mid-1960s, there was no computers. There certainly were no cell phones, databases, or any of all of those kinds of informative processes available. But since the mid-1960s, we've been losing about 1% of solve rate a year.
And what do you attribute?
I'm sorry, and the population has gone up significantly as well.
What do you attribute? What did you conclude you can attribute this to?
What I found is that, for example, in the mid-1960s, if you were committing lust murder, there were homicides being committed in that, and most of them involved some sort of relationship issue. And when I say relationship, I don't know. I buy you a beer, and then I decide I don't like the way you part your hair. After several beers, okay, I lose at pool. It's domestic violence gone to its worst extreme.
Right.
We're high school buddies having an argument and whatever, or it's kind of maybe some macho things, but what society was in the 1960s and the kind of country that we were, getting to be very mobile, and then we became highly mobile, and as a result of, and then fractured as a result. I live in Oregon. I was raised in Kansas. My parents, on the other hand, married and lived in the same location in Kansas from the time they were, they were teenagers when they got married.
Sure.
Then they settled in the same place that my father's father lived. That doesn't happen. That doesn't happen as much now as it did then. Again, we're highly mobile. In some ways, as much connection as we have, like you and I chatting now, we're more disconnected socially in terms of the way in which we perceive each other than we have been before. Right? The society has changed, and society's always changed. But what has happened is that some of the processes, if you will, the policies, the conceptualizations in regards to best practices for investigations have not changed.
I see.
Okay, and so where society has moved along, in some ways we have not. Bells and whistles and tools are nice, but they have to be rightly applied. Okay? It does no good to find that there's some DNA of the scene if you don't have anything to connect or relate it to, or if some policy process inhibits you from moving the investigation forward in any significant way. And then there, lastly, it's not necessarily least of all, is a direction or sourcing of funds for investigative purposes. The number of identified serial murderers in the United States, those persons that we identified, bring to justice, they're in court. They got arrested. We've been able to identify that there's 2-3 bodies associated with their behaviors. Where we saw a peaking, an ever annual increase of numbers associated with that. Excuse me, up until 2001. Funds have been done differently with now since 2001. So you don't have some of the resources, people, and money going to that type of processes.
Right.
We
yeah.
only
So
Go ahead.
Despite the problem, there's not any solution for it. There's cutting resources. So there's definitely a need for something like what you have done with this book in terms of a valuable resource, because it's one of the few bright spots.
Well, thank you. What the book tries to do is by putting these tools together in a, I hope, relatively comprehensive way, and
right.
showing that there is a more comprehensive way of utilizing these various techniques to help investigators identify, but also saying that there are some processes as well, anyways, to support those in investigative practices, so that if they do come across a scene that is represented in this more comprehensive modeling, that they can have an opportunity identifying it. And that really is the first key in any investigation, is what am I looking at? What is the crime? Is it a burglary, or was it a rape ultimately, or a homicide, and that one of the vehicles of being able to commit that was that one had to commit the burglary to, the breaking into the house, the residence, the building, in order to affect it.
Yes. Now, this book has come out in 2010, and was there any surprises on how this book has been utilized, or any pleasant surprises on how well this has been received or adopted?
Well, I don't know. I don't know how great its distribution has been. I know that I've received emails and discussions from folks in Europe, South America, up into Canada, various places in the various places in the United States. So I'm assuming that it's had something of a reception.
Right.
There's not a lot of money pouring in.
Sure. Well, it never is. Yeah.
Right.
Welcome to publishing. Yeah.
Right. I don't think it's going to make. It's not going to make me rich, but I didn't write it for that reason.
No.
I wrote it to create a tool, or one of the tools, in an investigation kit, if you will, that might be of use to the folks that are in the field doing the work. As I was.
Certainly, and you know the thing is the understandability of this book and what you've written, and of course when you're taking three of the most, some of the most popular or infamous serial killers of all time to study as well, it really does have an application, because many people have read true crime books or read articles or read a lot of information about those murderers. So I found it interesting you did Dahmer and then Bundy and BTK, where your average person wouldn't think of those as lust murders. So I found it interesting that you put that, that you dispelled those myths and made a very interesting case for lust murder and its definition. And it's a fascinating book and an incredible subject as well. So very. The true crime market, the people that read the books are fascinated with the kind of statistics that you have, that just 33% of these murders annually go unsolved, and then a certain percentage of those seem to be these lust murders. And with the phenomena of people wanting to be famous, it seems that certainly this phenomenon has always been around, but we get to see more dramatic examples of it, I think.
Well, right, and the thing with the thing about reported murders is that is just it. It is the identified, discovered homicide, which means that we have a body, or we have some indication that that particular sort of violence took place. But it's only those about which we know. Right. And the thing with serial murderers, as I think you mentioned earlier, is those are the ones we know about. As you recall, during one of the interviews that was conducted with Ted Bundy, one of the FBI agents asked him if it was true that he had killed, 23 young women.
Right.
And he replied, "You might be closer if you put a 0 on the end of that." Now, whether that was truth or brag or bravado, I don't know. But all we know is about those that are discovered. These are not, the old myth is what they're wanting to do is get caught. It doesn't stand at all. It's a nice fiction, but the problem is that its province is best in the fiction category. They don't intend to get caught. That is the idea. They intend to continue to want to be successful at, therefore not caught, for doing the harm that they do.
Well, it's especially evident when you have a killer like Jeffrey Dahmer, who was learning and practicing to dispose of his victims entirely, not leave any body at all, confine his atrocities to his own home. And he's not the only serial killer that has done that. So when we talk about people missing, like you say, that those are the bodies that are found, but these same type of lust murderers could well be the kinds of killers that are disposing of their bodies once their usefulness is finished, and then just keeping trophies or revisiting, sites. So there's
like all of these folks did, like all of the three that I looked at, and people don't necessarily. And that whole thing you asked at one point, or mentioned one point, that not Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy committed necrophilia.
Right.
Remember that continuum concept?
Sure.
In regards to a continuum of violence for persons that are committing serial murder, necrophilia is just on the continuum. The last point of the continuum before total, so it usually seems to be total decompensation of the individual committing the crimes, is cannibalism.
Yeah.
So
that's sort of like the next last step, and doesn't mean that,
Sure.
of course, all these steps can take place at a point. But much of this violence that they commit is progressive.
Yeah.
Each new level.
And in your book, you really do cover the development in these cases as well. You go more into the childhood and talk about maybe not necessarily triggers, but behavior that seems to somewhat explain anyway. Obviously, every individual is different and responds to different trauma or events, but it certainly gives people a really interesting background to see the progression, as you say, into the unspeakable, and then even a further progression as they descend almost into madness at the end and get more frantic, and especially with the case of Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer. So, very
yes. Well, and BTK might be a wee bit of an exception, although his full set of predictions that he had in terms of behaviors were quite remarkable. But and those in which he as I think I mentioned in the book, the officers who were interviewing him began to interview him, wondering how much information they were going to be able to get from him. And then they couldn't shut him up.
Well, I heard you on Burl Bear say that very thing, that you couldn't shut him up after that. It's like, oh no, what have we started here?
Yes. And it's that ironically amusing kind of point, but it was he saw himself, perceived of himself as being kind of a member of that law enforcement community. Of course, he did. He had his bachelor's degree in criminal justice, but he was never hired by a criminal justice agency because he was not successful in the taking the psychological test.
Lucky. Yeah, who knows what kind of serial killer would have been if he would have had a badge. I mean, geez.
Well, he did, and that was the problem. He had a badge in that small community, and he was, because of that, he had this assumed authority, Boy Scout leader, president of his church, all those sorts of things that when we look at a person in that kind of paper process, we assume good things.
Yeah, certainly.
Right. Those essentially were some of the masking features.
Well, certainly, too, we talk about Ted Bundy. Ann Rule, law enforcement professionals working at a suicide hotline, and unbeknownst to her, here's the most infamous serial killers of all time, showing empathy and friendship, and so,
Practicing? Practicing?
Pardon me?
Practicing.
Yeah. Yes, practicing, absolutely, fascinating. Well, Janet, I want to thank you very much, Dr. Janet McClellan, for this interview, talking about erotophonophila, investigating lust murder. It's been very enjoyable and very eye-opening. Great book, by the way, and thank you very much for this interview.
Well, Dan, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you, and you have a great night, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you again. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.